Chapter 12. A miserly autumnal squall swept through Little Britain. It swirled up leaves and litter, hurling them into the empty frame of Smithfield Market, looming from the darkness. Ian wrapped his arms tightly around his body. "You're sure we can't stay?" he asked the guard. "It would only be until midnight." The guard, a hospital porter in a bulletproof vest, only shrugged. He didn't look at all comfortable pointing a gun at them, but Ian knew better than to try his luck. "Rules is rules," said the man. "Can't make exceptions. You know where we'd end up." Ian couldn't blame him. Of course the hospital had to turn them all out at night. Their resources were horrifically limited, and they couldn't risk being overrun. Ian thanked the man, which earned him a wide, surprised smile, and made his way over to Barbara and Bamford. They had taken shelter in a doorway. "No room at the inn?" asked Bamford. Her words might be cheery, but there was something blank and lifeless about her eyes. "Not tonight," he replied. "We've got 3 hours before we're due to meet the others. What do you think?" "We can't hang about around here," said Barbara. "I don't think it's safe." "It's too exposed," agreed Bamford. She looked all round. "I could do with a drink," she said. "Only fun's still being a problem." "I've been thinking about that, actually," said Ian, keeping his voice low. "I think there may be an answer." He reached into his pocket and withdrew the wedding ring he had taken from his other late self. It glinted coldly, catching the light from the hospital foyer. "We can sell this." "But you can't," said Barbara. "It's not right." Bamford, however, was more practical. "Whose is it?" she asked. "It belonged to me," said Ian, looking quickly between the women as he spoke. "Another me, one who came through the hoop. The doctor said he was from a different world, a different branch of time. Something to do with the hoop changing history." She nodded, understanding. "Some kind of kink in causality, yes? You probably know more about it than we do. He died. He died saving me, and I've been carrying this ever since." "It's all right, Ian," said Barbara, reaching out to him. "You had a connection," Bamford said, matter-of-factly. "He was you." "Yes," said Ian, "but he also wasn't me. I realise that now. He did things differently. He did things I wouldn't do." Again Bamford nodded. "That must have been odd." Her eyes suddenly came alive. "Cocked things up good and proper, didn't we?" "It's not exactly gone according to plan, has it?" laughed Ian. "I don't think anyone could have foreseen what's happened." Barbara still had his arm. "You're putting him behind you?" she said. "I won't forget," he replied, "but I don't owe him anything. That man wasn't me." "That's what I told you," she said quietly. Ian found himself drawn to her, their eyes locking. "Yes," he said. They gazed at each other, and Ian could feel that everything had changed between them. He and Barbara now stood on the cusp of something new. "Ahem," Bamford muttered, winking when they both looked round. "Can we do this over that drink?" "Now, you're sure this is everything?" asked the doctor, flicking quickly through another 3-inch thick paper on their various experiments. Kelly thought that the old man might even have read the thing in that instant. He was more like a wizard than a scientist. The heap of artifacts towered above the doctor's head. Machinery was scattered around his feet, too, as were great blocks of paper, copies of all their reports and findings. It had taken hours to get it all in one room. Susan and Griffiths crouched down on the floor, Griffiths taking instruction on how the bits fitted together. Kelly leaned in closer, hoping to glean something he could actually comprehend. But no, the assorted systems and circuits and wiring meant nothing to him. Even the terms Susan used were a mystery. What in heaven was a horoscope? The man's accent, Scandinavian maybe, didn't help. Kelly could take some comfort, though, that it meant nothing to any of his colleagues either. They stood shoulder to shoulder, crammed against the back wall of the lab, all desperate to understand what was happening. "Oh, yes," grinned Townsend, as if he were somehow still in charge. "It's everything from the vault and everything we've been working on, but is it enough, Doctor?" His voice was shrill with excitement. "Can you make any part of it work?" The Doctor jutted out his jaw, not committing himself. That was agonizing. At his feet, Susan inspected another alien component, thought better of it, and tossed it over her shoulder. The next piece, some kind of twinned coil, she handed to Griffiths. It seemed strange, thought Kelly, his being junior to the girl. It reinforced the obvious conclusion that these people had to be from the future. They continued to work, content, it seemed to Kelly, just to play with the pieces, to tease the scientists. Kelly's colleagues jostled against each other for the best view, taking their frustration and ignorance out on one another, whispering predictions about what the Doctor's creation might do. They all hushed as Susan looked up at her grandfather. Her smile was angelic. "I think we've got a loop," she said simply. The scientists buzzed with excitement, though they were no wiser for what she had just said. Kelly noted the change that had come over the girl since he had first seen her on the doorstep. She'd been mousy and quiet, like the women he had known at the barracks. Now she had become like a child, laughing and grinning and making noise. In any other circumstance, someone would have snapped at her, insisted she behave. Yet the old man treated her as an equal, and nobody in the room would dare to contradict him. "Good," said the Doctor. "Good work, Susan." She glowed with pride as he glanced over what she and Griffiths had assembled. It didn't look much, a few odds and ends crudely soldered together, wires tendrilling out to power sockets and controls. The old man, however, seemed happy. He handed the thing back to Susan and walked calmly towards Townsend. "We'll be able to give you a demonstration," he said to the scientists. Kelly found himself grinning like a schoolboy. He wasn't alone in that. Susan helped Griffiths pile the discarded artifacts into a tidier heap. She measured the distance between the heap and the block they were going to focus their attentions on, did a hasty calculation in her head, and nodded to the Doctor. Obviously, they didn't want to imperil the unused materials. Perhaps further work could be focused on them? The sort of thing Kelly could spearhead. He saw himself contributing useful secondary analysis, while his peers all fought to work alongside the Doctor. "Well?" asked Townsend. "You'll all need to stand back," said the Doctor. Muttering, the scientists edged back to the door of the lab. Kelly ignored the elbows of an over-anxious colleague. "Mr. Griffiths," said the Doctor, "your phone too." Griffiths looked for a moment like he might argue, but he did as he was told. The remarkable wireless device sat neatly on the top of the heap of discarded materials. Kelly couldn't see how it fitted in, but perhaps it emitted signals or energy that could be harmful to the test. No doubt it would all become clear. They were on the brink of a glorious new scientific age, and they'd have to learn to be patient for the Doctor's explanations. The Doctor and his assistants stepped back from the block. "Switch on," the Doctor commanded. Townsend had the honour of pressing down the lever. At first, nothing discernible happened. Kelly held his breath, willing the miracle to begin. Gradually, he became conscious of the low hum of power as the alien artifacts came to life. "I do beg your pardon," interrupted the Doctor. "Would you like a better view?" Kelly nodded his thanks, never once taking his eyes off the machinery. He tried not to show his frantic eagerness. The Doctor, Griffiths, and Susan passed between the scientists, letting them jostle forward. "Not too close," warned the Doctor indulgently, now stood behind them all. The machinery continued to growl with power. Light began to leak from the cables. The noise became louder. Pens rattled on a desk, then clattered to the floor. Kelly could feel the vibration in his joints and gums. Someone ought to be taking notes, he thought, a pen hanging in his hand. They should record their thoughts for posterity. But he could simply not move, transfixed by the light ever brightening. It was beautiful. He'd never forget this for the rest of his life, he felt sure. The air all round the machinery blurred. Kelly felt the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. His vision swam. No, it was the far side of the room, bleeding in on itself like a mirage. The noise was now deafening. It grew, and he could almost feel his teeth loosening. He could not tear his gaze away, like it was dragging him forward and into it and through it, and... There was silence. His ears rang. The light, the brilliant light, had simply winked off, and Kelly blinked to clear the spots from his eyes. No one spoke for some moments. With the vanishing of the light, all the precious alien relics had vanished too. The discarded stuff, the pile of papers and notes, even the block that had done it had gone. The lab was empty. It was the most remarkable conjuring trick. The scientists applauded wildly. They turned to each other, patted each other's backs. It worked. It bloody well worked. Everything they'd been doing had changed. "Brilliant," said Townsend, choked with emotion. "Quite brilliant." He stood on tiptoe to see over the massed ranks of scientists in his way. "So, Doctor," he called, "how do we get everything back?" Kelly saw Townsend's face fall. "Doctor?" The dead Ian's wedding ring earned them a pile of grubby notes from the landlord of a pub round the corner from the hospital. He asked no questions, which Ian was grateful for, and included their first 3 pints in the deal. The dark ale was called New London. Ian delighted in the never-forgotten skill of pressing the 3 glasses together to carry them back to the others. The women had found a quiet spot at the back of the pub. No one even looked their way. Everyone kept themselves to themselves. As a result, the pub felt safer than the place they'd been in earlier that afternoon. "Sorry," said Ian, as he put down the drinks. "This is all they had. No gin and tonics any more." "Well," said Bamford, raising her glass, "to time being all over the place." They clinked drinks, and Ian took a long, indulgent sip. He felt his eyes water. The beer was quite revolting. "It's an interesting flavour," Barbara said, and though she had obviously meant it sincerely, they laughed. "I guess we have to make do," said Ian. Again the women laughed, no doubt at the heartbreak in his voice. Nobody spoke for a while after that. Ian listened to the murmurings coming from other tables around them. He could not pick out the individual words being said, but from the soft-spoken tones, peppered with good-natured chuckling, he could tell that stories were being spun. It all felt so familiar to him, so very close to home. "So," said Bamford, stretching in her seat as she relaxed, "how long have you two been together?" Before Ian could say a word, the look on his face must have given her the answer. "Oh," she said, "sorry." "It's not like that," said Barbara, sitting back in her seat as if to distance herself from Ian. "We're only friends," said Ian, though he knew that wasn't right either. They had become more than just friends. "Sorry," said Bamford again. "Got the wrong end of the stick." She took a swig of beer, and Ian thought the glass might have hidden a wry smile. "Bamford," he began, feeling he should protest on Barbara's behalf if not his own. Bamford put down her drink. "You don't have to call me that," she said quietly. "My name is Louise." Ian couldn't think of her as Louise. It was a girl's name. It seemed strange that the dangerous, bullying old general could have had a first name at all. He realized Bamford was still waiting for someone to respond. "We know nothing about each other, do we?" he said. "Tell us about yourself, Louise," said Barbara. Bamford, Louise, leaned back in her chair. "I was born in 1976, she said. When I was 5, Mum died, and I got taken in by friends of hers. Joined the army in 87. "But you'd only have been 11, Barbara said. Bamford shrugged. The war, you know. Didn't know anything else. Passed some exams and got into the scientific corps. Married in 2001, no kids yet. 2004, I stepped through the hoop and lost everything. Not everything, said Ian. What have I got? You. Ha! I can't be me when I never existed. She smiled. Louise Bamford was from another branch of time. I'm this whole other person. She took another long sip from her pint, and Ian watched her, amazed by the change. She really had become someone else. Now, said Bamford, wiping beer from the corners of her mouth, why don't you tell me about you two? And you're sure that they can't get anywhere now? Laughed Susan, as they hurried by Trafalgar Square and onto the Strand. My dear child, said the doctor, breathless from the run, it took them 34 years to get anywhere in the first place, and that was when they had working examples to copy. I should say that without their precious relics, those gentlemen couldn't come up with a digital watch. Griffiths decided they'd run far enough. The scientists could give chase, but they'd had enough of a start, and besides, he'd keep them to the shadows. The doctor and Susan were glad of the change of pace. You've changed history, then? Asked Griffiths. Oh, I hope so, young man, I hope so. And where did you send everything? Isn't there a chance they can get it all back? The great problem of transmaterialization of matter, said the doctor, is the effect that dense objects nearby can have. If you don't compensate properly, everything ends up in the sun, laughed Susan. Yes, Susan. So the time travel experiments are at an end. We have undone them. Griffiths could see the old man wasn't entirely happy. There was still one question left to be answered. And your own ship? You know where that is? The doctor's face fell. I had thought it would be the source of their efforts, but you heard them. They knew nothing about a police box. No. So we're all stranded here, then. This isn't the best of times to be stuck in. Perhaps, said the doctor, with a far-off look. But I never say never. Perhaps young Bamford knows more than we think. You mean she's got the TARDIS? Asked Susan. Not as such. But her elder self must have discovered it. Before she died, she told us how she had locked it away. And you believed her? Asked Susan. It's the only chance we have. That's why you sent the others with her, isn't it? Said Griffiths. Yes, said the doctor. I didn't want her fate to change. Whoever she's gone to see, if that's where she would have gone, then that's where she must go now. If we change her responses, we'll never find the ship again. And you trust Ian and Barbara? They know not to interfere, said the doctor. Now that's our only hope. They crossed Lancaster Place, leading on their right across Waterloo Bridge. Suddenly, the doctor grabbed Griffiths by the arm, tried to bustle him and Susan into the nook of a doorway shrouded from the Strand. Quickly, he snapped. Griffiths resisted, began to protest, when he heard the engine. A car far off on the street behind them, but getting ever louder. They huddled together silently, waiting. After an eternity, the car sped past, showing no police or military markings. Brakes screeched as it arced left round the back of Bush House. Griffiths waited until he could no longer hear it before letting the others back out onto the street. Was that them? Asked the doctor. Are they pursuing us? I think so, said Griffiths, though it was just the one car. Well, they didn't know which direction we would run in, snapped the doctor. They've probably sent cars out all over the city. Do you think they'll come back? Susan asked Griffiths. Griffiths glanced quickly at the doctor, uncomfortable at the girl treating him as the leader. Probably, he said. Let's keep moving. They carried on past Somerset House and the boarded-up shop fronts. Susan kept running ahead 10 or 20 metres, then hopped about waiting for them to catch her up. Griffiths stayed with the doctor, knowing Susan could make an escape when the car came back, but that the old man was in no shape to run for it. He remembered the doctor's earlier plea to take Susan on should anything happen to him. But surely this wasn't what he had in mind. Were the doctor captured by the scientists now, if they interrogated him, then all his efforts to change history could be undone. Griffiths could not allow that to happen. He would have to protect the doctor. "Come on," Susan called. She was nervy, energized by the chase. "You're enjoying this," he said as they caught her up. "No," she said, shaking her head. Okay. I'm glad you're feeling a bit better anyway. That man the other day." Susan glanced quickly at her grandfather, who seemed not to notice. Griffith saw the misery inside her, the despair. "You don't have to tell me anything," he said. She didn't respond, perhaps unsure whether to confide in him. "I can't imagine what an attack like that must have been like." Susan bit her lip, as if to keep the words in. "But he didn't attack me," she said. "It wasn't like that." She stopped short. A car was hurtling towards them. "Get her out of here," said the doctor. "We're not leaving you behind," said Griffiths, just as firmly. "Don't be obstinate, man," the doctor began, but Susan ran over and clung to him. Griffiths looked quickly around, hoping for some kind of advantage to present itself. Nothing. The car skidded to a halt. 2 men leapt out, yelling and waving guns at them. As Griffith stepped forward to intercept one, he noted they were wearing lab coats. Neither knew what they were doing with their weapons. Griffith smacked the first man in the jaw. As the man fell back, Griffiths kicked him so that he smashed headfirst into the car. The second man, mouth agape, waggled his gun ineffectually. Griffiths tore it from his hand and then knocked the man to the ground. He clicked the safety catch off the gun and coolly aimed at the ridge between the man's eyes. "Wait!" called the doctor. Griffiths didn't look round. He stared into the terrified eyes of the man on the ground. It was Kelly. "We can't let him compromise us," Griffiths said. The last time he'd pointed a gun at Kelly, he'd been ready to kill the doctor, too. Times, he thought wryly, had changed. "You don't need to kill them," said the doctor. "We can take the car. We can let him live." "He'll have the others after us," said Griffiths. "I won't," blubbed Kelly. "I promise I won't." "We'll be long gone by then," said the doctor. "Please," said Susan. It was the horror in her voice that finally persuaded him. She was appalled by what he had done, how ruthlessly he had put down their pursuers. Griffiths lowered the gun. Kelly scrambled away from him, tears streaming down his face. Susan ran to help the man to his feet, but he cried out in alarm and she backed off. "We're not what you think," she said miserably. "We came to help you." Kelly paid no heed, his head in his hands as he wept. "Pick your friend up," Griffiths told him. Kelly didn't hesitate to obey. He hurried over and dragged his barely conscious colleague to his feet. They stumbled over to the far side of the road. With the wounded man, thought Griffiths, it would take him longer to reach his comrades, to tell him what had happened. And they would be on foot, having just surrendered their car. Griffiths opened the driver's door. "Oh," he said, "it's a stick shift." "That doesn't present a challenge to me," said the doctor, brushing him aside and taking the front seat. Susan hurried round and got in behind the passenger seat. She didn't once look at Griffiths, and as he too got into the car, he found himself ashamed. "I won't apologise," he told them, while the doctor studied the various controls of the car. "We're still at risk, letting them go like this." "Of course we're not," said the doctor, crunching the key in the ignition. The car started forward with a lurch. "Don't underestimate mercy, young man. We all have need of it sometimes." He fought the gear stick into reverse and managed a clumsy 3-point turn. As they sped off east towards St. Paul's Cathedral, Griffiths realised that it didn't matter if they found the police box or not. He would never go with the doctor and Susan. For one thing, he was chafed by their disapproval, and the fact that he knew that their morality bested him. And for another, he thought as he gripped his seat, He didn't for a minute trust the doctor's driving. "She's hiding it well, but she's distraught," said Barbara, watching the door to the ladies in case Louise should suddenly return. Ian nodded. "Yes," he said. "It's a good thing we were here for her. She'd be in pieces otherwise, but she won't show that with us around. I think she's keeping it together for our sakes." It was a horrible thought. "And if she'd been on her own?" Barbara asked. "What would have happened to her then?" "We've seen what happened, Barbara. We saw what she became." "Yes, but—" The door to the ladies opened, and Barbara shut her mouth. Louise ambled towards them. She had been drinking quickly, a full pint ahead of them at the last round. It had done her good. She rubbed her hands together. "One more," she said. "They've called time," said Ian. "We should be getting back to the rendezvous." "You're no fun," said Louise. "Anyway, time doesn't apply to us in the same way. We're different," she grinned. "We've branched out." "We need to meet up with the others," Barbara told her, guiding her towards the door. "The doctor should have found the ship by now, and then we can all get away from here." "It's not so bad here," said Ian. He didn't look keen to swap the pub for the biting gale outside. "Beer grows on you," agreed Louise. "We have to go," said Barbara. The street was dark and silent, but it seemed to her that it was not quite so cold. That might just have been the beer inside her, of course. In the old days, Barbara could make a spritzer last an entire evening, but tonight had been special. It hadn't just been about looking after Louise. No, it had been about celebrating with Ian, sharing time with him. Their time in the future had almost separated them, split them up. Now they were back together, and it felt like they had never been closer. With Louise and Griffiths about to join them all in the TARDIS, their lives would be very different. Life with the Doctor and Susan was always moving, but now, for the first time in ages, she felt things had really changed for them all. She tagged along behind Ian and Louise as they made their way back towards the cathedral. "You'll be pleased to see Griffiths again, I expect," Ian said to Louise. "I just said he's sort of interesting," she said. She froze, as if she'd given too much away. "I mean, if I weren't spoken for, which I guess I'm not." "You don't have to be embarrassed," said Ian. He winked at Barbara. "I think Susan's rather taken with him too." "You don't really think so," said Louise. The alley led them into the street, St. Paul's towering at one end. "Oh, yes," agreed Barbara. "She's quite smitten." "But he can't feel the same way about her," said Louise. "I mean, she's just too young for him." Ian continued to tease her about Griffiths. The more Louise denied it, the more entangled she got. They followed the road round the side of St. Paul's, back to the exact spot where they'd left the Doctor and the others. There was no one waiting for them. Barbara saw Bamford glance quickly at her watch. The others were late. "We shouldn't stay out in the open," said Ian. Louise, too, was all seriousness. "We can't hang around for them either," she said. "If they've run into trouble, they might have given away our position." "The Doctor would never betray us," said Barbara. Across the street, car headlights flicked on. The light was blinding in the dark, and they all had to look away. The car sped towards them, gears seething at the effort. "Damn," said Louise. "Want to run for it?" "There's no point," said Ian grimly. "We've nowhere to run to now." "I guess a cell is at least a bed for the night," nodded Louise. "We don't know we're being arrested," said Barbara. "But if the Doctor and the others were late for their rendezvous, then something must have gone horribly wrong." "Have you young people been drinking?" The Doctor's sharp tone cut into the night. He was leaning from the driving seat of the car. "We've been waiting hours for you." Amazed, delighted, Barbara could only shake her head. "It's only just after midnight," said Ian. "We thought something had happened to you." muttered the doctor as he climbed from the car, his bad temper masking his genuine concern for them. "We're fine," Barbara told him. "Louise has just had a bit of a shock, that's all." "Louise?" "That's me," said Louise. The doctor glared first at her, then at Barbara and Ian. Barbara couldn't meet his gaze. She felt so wretched the way he looked at her. "What have you done to her?" he asked. "I'm a different person now," Louise told him proudly. "I can see that young lady," he said, aghast. His attention was still fixed on Ian and Barbara. "What have you two fools done?" "What is it, Doctor?" asked Griffiths, emerging from the passenger side door. Susan was close behind him, eager to see what the shouting was about. "They," said the doctor, shaking a finger at his friends. "They—" It was terrible to see him lost for words. "We'll never find the TARDIS now," said Susan, her eyes on Louise. "Bamford was our only hope." Barbara turned to Louise, but she had no idea what she was being accused of either. "You didn't find the ship?" asked Ian. "No," said the doctor, more wearily than Barbara had ever known him. "They weren't using it. They didn't have it. We dealt with what they did have." "The time experiments are over," said Griffiths. "That's good, though, isn't it?" said Barbara. "It's what you had to do." "But it means we're stranded here now," said Susan. "We won't ever find the ship again." "We'll just have to make do here," said Griffiths. "We can make something better than the future we've all seen." The doctor sighed. "I admire your intentions, young man, I do. And we should be grateful for what has been achieved. But, you see, the ship is part of me, and without it—" "We'll get it back," said Susan. "Somehow. We'll think of something." The doctor patted her hands. "It could be anywhere," he said. "It could have arrived at any time." "But you thought I was going to lead you there," said Louise. "There was a chance, yes," said the doctor. "You thought I had it in the future." "Yes," said the doctor. "Evidently." Barbara, though, could see what Louise was getting at. "We didn't tell you we'd met your future self," she said. "We met you in 30 years' time, after this, after tonight, and long after you must have discovered about your mother." "What exactly about her mother?" asked the doctor. "I never existed," Louise told him flatly. "The experiment wrote me out of time." "I'm sure that can't—" the doctor began. "Vagrants killed my mum before she'd even met my dad. That's going to nix things." The doctor took a step forward. "I'm sorry," he said, and clearly he meant it. His thoughts for himself were all forgotten. "Time is in flux," he said, "changing every second. Nothing is safe. Nothing." Barbara saw how his heart went out to her, and she understood. Louise was an exile in time, cut off from everything she had known. She was like the doctor now. "But where did Bamford find the TARDIS?" asked Susan. It seemed strange now to hear Louise called by her surname. "I can't think what would have become of me if you'd not come to find me," said Louise. It clearly didn't matter to her why they had done so. She was still grateful. "But where would you have gone?" Susan persisted. "I've no idea," shrugged Louise. "There's nothing anywhere here for me." "You couldn't have stayed out in the cold," said Ian. "No," said Louise. "I'd have probably looked for shelter, like those poor people on—" She stopped short, her eyes wide. "On the Isle of Dogs." "Oh!" said Susan. "I know that, oh," said the doctor, rounding on her. "What have you done, child?" "I've already told you," she protested. "When we first arrived, when we went to find a phone to tell them, it was there, by the traffic light tree." Susan was nearly in tears as she tried to get the words out. Ian finished her sentence for her. "We found a police box," he said. Bamford had been given the front seat, so she would have the best view as the doctor drove them back to Canary Wharf. Griffith sat in the back, squished next to Susan, Barbara and Ian. Susan couldn't sit still and kept pushing forward to see better or to interrupt the doctor's conversation. She still hadn't forgiven Griffiths for how rough he had been with Kelly before, and when he asked her to sit still or to stop bashing him with her elbows, she had affected not to hear. "But it wasn't like the TARDIS," she insisted. "I couldn't have recognised it. It was bigger, different. It didn't feel alive." The doctor eased onto Commercial Road, taking the corner carefully because of the weight of the car. "If the ship had been neglected such a long time," he said, "it would have fended for itself. It would shut down systems, update its appearance, try to pass unnoticed. You know it would rather that than be found by anyone, Especially when it had lost us." "But it's still a police box," said Susan. "Yes," said the doctor. "Dear, dear, I'd hoped that given enough time it would have worked out how to fix that itself." Griffiths had seen too much in the last few days to be surprised by the thought of a police box changing its shape. "So you think it could be the TARDIS?" Susan continued. "It might be, child, it might be. We will have to see. But you shouldn't get your hopes up. We might still be stuck here for good." "But it's not so terrible here," said Louise. "We've met good people, and we've only got into trouble where people have been desperate." "They're lacking leadership," Griffiths called from the back. "Direction," Louise corrected him. "That's what they're after. And you think you might be the person to give them that." The doctor placed the words carefully, Griffiths noted. He was testing Louise, concerned she might yet still become the old battle-axe they had met before. "Maybe," she said. "It's just frustrating seeing the city in ruins. If we could only get people working for something better." "Something better, yes," said the doctor. "But you want to be careful about how you make them work," said Griffiths. "You can't just order them about." "No," said Louise. "But you could play to their aspirations, offer them a better world." "That sounds a little fascist," warned Barbara. She obviously saw shades of the future Bamford in this conversation, Bamford the dictator. "Strength doesn't need to be vicious," said Louise. "We should play to their better sides, not to their fears and suspicions." "You could make a difference," mused the doctor, nodding. They were all quiet, as if his approval was all that really mattered. He understood what Louise was proposing, and that it wasn't in any way the same as what General Bamford had been about. She really was a different person now. "We can help people," said Griffiths, and he found he was looking forward to it. To build a better world. That was, after all, what he had been fighting for all these long years. "Yes," said the doctor. "Fear isn't any strength at all. It's weakness. You could give them something better, though. You could use what you know about the future to make something better." He sounded almost envious of the prospect. "You could give them hope." They continued on, Commercial Road leading them ever nearer to the Isle of Dogs. Eventually, they could see the turn-off onto West Ferry Road. "It was at the next roundabout," squealed Susan, again jabbing elbows into Griffiths' side. They all craned forward to see. But there was no traffic light tree to be seen, only rubbish and ruin. The traffic lights had yet to be built, and there was no sign of any police box. The doctor eased the car to a halt at the side of the road. The night was silent around them. "Maybe we could just have a look round," he said, utterly bereft. Griffiths could see the toll this disappointment had taken on him. He uncurled himself from the car, and the others spilled out beside him. The night was cool after the enforced snugness of the journey. The Thames shooshed quietly by, while black-on-black silhouettes of buildings suggested phantoms and dangers if they strayed from where they stood. There was no one about. Griffiths was thankful. Susan had taken the doctor's arm. "I can almost feel its proximity," said the doctor. "I'm sure the ship can't be far." But there was nothing to be seen. Nobody said it. Nobody would say it. But the police box could have arrived decades ago. It could have been taken by anyone. The vagrants could have claimed it, recognizing it from their trip through time. They could have carted it off, or dropped it into the Thames. There were no clues left. The doctor and his friends were prisoners of this time now. Griffiths was glad of it. He and Louise would need allies to help them build their new world. They stretched their legs, keeping each other in sight at all times. The doctor and Susan wandered away from the others down the hill. "I'm sorry," the doctor told his granddaughter, "but perhaps it's better this way. You need a life somewhere." They hugged. Griffiths turned away, allowing them privacy. He stalked up the road to where Louise and the others were. They were looking across the road and down between dark buildings to West India Quay, where they had all arrived themselves. A shabby figure, a man just visible on the quayside, had seen them. The vagrant now hobbled their way. "Who is he?" asked Louise. "I've no idea," said Ian. "We don't know anyone here." They stood where they were, letting the figure get slowly closer. He was mostly kept hidden by the shadows of warehouses, and he looked used to keeping himself out of sight. His shaven head and shaggy beard gleamed white where they caught moonlight between the buildings. He was old, Griffiths could tell, perhaps in his 70s, though he must have lived rough for a long time. He reached the last of the buildings, now directly across the road from them, and paused. His clothes were shabby and didn't quite fit, but Griffiths could see the effort he'd made with his appearance. The clothes were clean for all they were ragged. He even wore a tie. For a moment, Griffiths thought he might be an Andrews, another parody of the one he himself had known. But no, it was clear he wasn't Andrews. "It's the man who attacked Susan," said Barbara. "He's come back." The man started across the road towards them. His eyes were staring. "We'll hold him off," said Ian, stepping past Barbara off down to the doctor and Susan. Griffiths, besides, squared his shoulders. "Keep away," he roared. He wouldn't kill the tramp. He had learnt better than that. Had he not, the man would be dead already. But he would protect the others. The man kept coming, and Griffiths found himself angry at being forced to tackle him. He resented having to fight. "We don't want to hurt you." The man wavered, considering. He took another step forward. Griffiths took a step forward too. He would let the man strike first, sure he'd be quicker and able to dodge. Suddenly, Susan leapt in front of him. "Don't hurt him," she begged. "But Susan," began Ian, reaching to drag her out of the way. "Don't you see?" wailed the girl. "Can't you see who he is?" She took Ian's arms, staring up into his face. "He's you!"